Good evening. We're here to read another Christmas story from our book. I'm joined tonight by my friends, the Snowman. We have another over here. There's one off camera over there. So we're just soaking up as much Christmas cheer as possible. Tonight's story, you might need to sit down there, fella. Tonight's story is The Christmas Nightingale by Eric P. Kelly. It was in the forest of Lubble in the days of King Casimir. The snow was crusty and hard beneath the hunter's foot, and the wind roared in the crowded pines. Few there were, peasants or townfolk, who cared to venture into the forest, for wolves and other wild beasts ran there seeking their food, and no less feared were those human wolves, exiles and thieves, who sought refuge there. Many miles from the main road, in the very center of this huge forest, there was a great clearing. One first became aware of it when the pines began to thin, and one could see a half circle of larches at the border, a tree seldom found in the whole domain of Poland. In the clearing inside the larch circle was a tiny grove of lindens, their branches bare and ragged in the frosty air. Beeches and oaks grew there also. In front of the lindens stood a small peasant cottage, built longer ago than men remembered. All about it in the earth were deep pits, where glowed red fires from which the peasant took charcoal to supply the kitchens of Lublin and Krasnik, many miles away. Warfare between beast and beast, man and man, and man and beast ended at the circle of larch trees surrounding the clearing. Since earliest time it had been on the books of the courts of the empire, of Bohemia and of Poland, among the Leks and the Russ and the Czechs, that the place of the charcoal burner in mid-forest was a sanctuary of abiding peace. The peasant there must kill no animal, save for protection or food or clothing, under pain of death. A stag fleeing from dogs was safe within that circle. Falcon pursuing pheasant must be recalled at the larches. Wolves becoming an annoyance to the charcoal burner or his family must be driven outside the circle if possible before being slain. Some say that this custom grew up because of the presence of the lindens, beneath which Saint Adalbert first preached Christ to the Slavs. Others say that the larch is a sacred tree, that it was once a tall woman with sharp head and round skirts, who was made immortal by the witches of Lithuania. Little Elizabeth says that there is always peace beneath the lindens, because our Lord was crucified upon a linden, and never again may blood be shed beneath its branches. Do they have those in Palestine? Practical-minded ones know that Otto of Germany instituted the decree because his charcoal burners living in the forest had slain much game, thus curtailing the pleasure of the gentry who kept horses and hounds. It was merry that night in the charcoal burner's humble hut. A great fire leaped and roared in the open fireplace, upon both sides of which hung dried vegetables in strings. The wife, busy with supper, ceased work for the moment to gaze at the happy scene. Her two sons, Michael and Powell, were weaving a rough skein of hemp into cord. Her husband was sharpening a charcoal cutter, and Elizabetta sat at his feet, engaged in childish prattle. Although some cold crept in through the chinks in the wall and thatch, none of them seemed to notice it in the rich glow of the fire. The spirit of the blaze was such magic that it transformed everything it touched. The rough stools into king's thrones, the pine bough beds into fancy couches, canopied and hung with damask. The pewter became the finest silver, the wooden spoons were white ivory, and the copper kettle shone like burnished gold. Elizabeth clapped her hands. I wonder what will come tonight. Perhaps a reindeer from the north. Nay, little one, the reindeer are gone these many years. They roam no more our Polish forests. There will be a hoot owl, offered Michael, the elder of the two boys. Not an owl, a crook, a raven, said Powell. Father, appealed Elizabetta, I will have no owl or crook. I will have my reindeer. Now let the child alone, the mother admonished the boys. It is dark in the forest, and there is much snow, went on Elizabetta, and through it there comes some living thing to seek our hearth. And God preserve him in this bitter cold, exclaimed the father. I hear the wind in the trees. It dies down when it reaches the larches. It was so when the reindeer came, answered the father reminiscently. There was snow on the ground, Elizabetta went on with a much told story. There was snow on the ground, and the moon shone, but it was very cold, said the father. Except within the lindens, the wind ceased at the larch trees, and the cold at the lindens. And there was peace, continued the man. Now, on that night there came a reindeer from the north. He was huge and handsome, and had horns like the branches of a tree. On his forehead shone a great star. And on his back, Elizabeth guided the course of the story. And on his back there rode a little boy as old as Elizabetta. About the boy's head there was a ring of fire, and the garments he wore were of white fur. In his right hand he carried a tiny tree which gleamed like a torch in the forest. The wolves stole away in front of him, and the stables and hares came out to look, knowing that nothing would harm them while he was in sight. Have you heard any of these interesting European stories before? It's a little different. He was the Christ child, said Elizabetta. I don't know what he was doing in Poland, but it's all very interesting. Straight through the forest went the reindeer until he came to the clearing where there was a cottage beneath the linden trees. It was the charcoal burner's cottage. He knocked at the door. As if the words had been taken from his lips and made real, there came at that very moment an actual knocking sound at the door. It was not the heavy blow of the knuckles that a man makes, not the continued knocking of a woman or child, but the brushing sound that an animal makes when it is fleeing for refuge toward the fire of its master. The father sprang to the door and opened it. The Christ child, screamed Elizabetta, for the figure of a boy was revealed. They all stood for a moment motionless until the mother, first of all to come to her senses, exclaimed, Christ child or no, the poor lad is nearly stiff from cold. Shut the door, Michael, and lead him to the fire. Then they crowded about him, scarcely daring to touch his garments. He, but a little aware of the stir he had created, looked up at them with the most human pair of brown eyes in the world, and tottered, exhausted from cold and hunger, fell in a faint in the good woman's arms. She laid him gently on a bed of boughs, which the boys dragged close to the fire. He will come to himself shortly, she gave as her opinion, after they had rubbed his limbs and done what they could for him, and then he must drink some hot soup. So, carefully straining a portion of borscht, beet soup, through a piece of cloth, she placed the bowl beside him and regarded him. Elizabetta, bolder than the rest, had done more than regard him. She passed her hands over his hair, which, uncaught by a cap, fell in golden ringlets about his shoulders. Then she touched a little silver ornament, a star with a white stone in the center, that hung about his neck. The velvet of his blouse, which matched his knickerbockers, was soft beneath her fingers. At throat and wrist were turned back the ruffled collar and cuffs of a silken shirt. A short time passed. He stirred and moaned, and his eyes opened again. The Lord bless you, exclaimed the mother. What do you call yourself, child? The lips moved, but no sound came from them. She raised him then and poured the soup into his mouth. He drank clear the bottom of the bowl, and she poured it full again. He is famished, she exclaimed. He was, but in his youthful body vitality soon reasserted itself. A touch of color appeared in his lips. The pulse began to throb again where Elizabetta held wrist and hand. He glanced eagerly here and there about the room as if searching for something that he knew, but, unable to find it, turned back to little Elizabetta, and with his gaze resting on her sweet childish face, the look of terror that had been apparent in his eyes died out in a flash, and the lids fell. God has sent him to our sanctuary, spoke the father softly. He slept there before the fire while the boys went out to gather more boughs. At length, when the flames began to flicker and die, Elizabetta sought her bed in the corner near her mother and father, while the two boys, scarcely daring to speak aloud, went to their rest with much nudging and whispering. The morning brought no further enlightenment concerning the identity of the guest. He was of gentle birth, that was clear, for the skin of hands and face was white and delicate to the touch. Beyond conjecture, however, it was impossible to go, for he could not speak a word, even under the kindest of persuasions. That he understood what was said, they perceived, for he would nod and shake his head or gesture with his hands. Perhaps he may have been born with some affliction, said the father, but more likely some fright in the woods has caused him to lose his power of speech. The good pastor from the distant church upon one of his visits gave the boy much attention, but was as perplexed as they. I have heard of no missing children in the houses of great folk hereabout, and such a one as this would have been sought for long ago. He has intelligence above the ordinary, anyone can see, and I too believe it was that night of wandering and terror in the woods that robbed him of his power of speech. I have seen men struck dumb by fright at lesser things. It was quite evident, though, that the memory of the dark time and what preceded it had gone from his mind, for he was now as happy as a lark. In the course of time, his coming was taken for granted. His fine clothes were laid carefully away, and one of Powell's homespun suits was fitted to him. The only reminder of his former state remained in the silver token which still hung about his neck, though hidden from sight beneath his rough blouse. He was then in his 5th or 6th year, perhaps, and entered readily into the outdoor life led by Michael and Powell. The soft white hands hardened, the cheeks filled and became ruddy, and his health improved daily. For 2 years he never spoke a word, although the foster parents tried in many ways to coax him to it, and even attempted to teach him as they had their own children. Something in his brain was dead, or sleeping. Then late one night in summer, in the 3rd year after his coming, the charcoal burner woke with a start from his slumber. Wife, he said, wake thyself. There is a nightingale in the cottage. Someone must have left the door open. Elizabetta had heard it too. She was sitting up in the pine boughs, trying to arouse the boys with whispering. For from the corner where the strange boy slept came a song miraculously like that of the nightingale. First there was the low sighing note which the bird breathes forth as it settles itself on a bough, and then the quaver expectant and marvelously human as it listens for the reply of its mate. A smooth flow of melody followed, and then there came the first notes of its inspired music before it pours forth its soul in song. Excuse me. Never was nightingale known to enter the house of human beings before, whispered the charcoal burner. We are much blessed, my wife. The song continued. In it were all the feelings of life on earth and life to come. There was the sadness of the poets, the love of mothers for their children, the affection of fathers for their own. It is not a bird, it is the stranger, cried little Elizabetta, gazing at the adopted boy. His lips are moving. I can see him in the light that falls through the chink in the thatch. At that he wakened, and the music ceased. Nevertheless, the next day the gift was still with him. The life in the open, the humble and healthy fare, the kindness and love everywhere about him had all begun to react upon the dark spell which had cast its shadow upon his consciousness. By some strange prank of nature, the long dumb tongue was gifted with unusual powers. Songs of birds he could reproduce almost to perfection. Calls of wild animals, the snarling of wolves, the baying of forest dogs, the hoot of owls. With these he delighted the charcoal burner's family. Then, though poured forth at first without words, came the songs of the common folk, the melodies which the workers sang at the pits, the joyous tunes and ballads that the children sing while they play. And from the depths of his heart came other songs that he had once heard, yet which brought no definite face or picture before him. One of these was a soft, low melody, which made one think of a pleasant dusk, the fading sunlight. The mother shed tears over it. It is thy dear mother's lullaby, she said, as she clasped him to her breast. Canst thou not remember her? He struggled with his thoughts, but that black curtain, bred of terror or cruelty, hung there, and he could not see behind it. And thus it was that they called him the Nightingale. With the passing of years he learned to speak, groping at the beginning for words like a child, seeking the meaning of things. His first word was Elzabeta, his second mother, and these 2 words he repeated over and over again, as if with pride and happiness in a beloved possession. He was about in his 12th year when there came the cold winter that men speak of today in the Lublin district. Frost settled early in the fall, driving away the summer birds a few weeks earlier than usual, and by the middle of the month of Lustopad, or falling leaves, November, the ground was covered with hard crusted snow. Huge flocks of the black birds called crux swarmed into Poland from the steppes of Asia and South Russia. Deer and wild boar crowded tamely together about the glowing charcoal pits in the forest. Mighty oaks cracked asunder of nights in the hideous cold, and the river Weispres was frozen clear to its muddy bed. From the towns came the call for wood and charcoal. Men and women crammed fuel into the brick stoves. Oh, thank you. And open hearths in an attempt to drive back the penetrating cold. And in such quantity did they consume this fuel that by the week before Christmas the supplies laid in for the whole winter had disappeared. At that, riders went forth from the towns, north and south, seeking for wood and charcoal. And in the forests the sound of axes and falling trees made the continual roar from morning till night. In the charcoal burners' pits, an unwanted supply of wood smoked and charred throughout the day, and when dusk fell, the towers of black smoke changed into vistas of red and yellow flames. One rider, making his way over the crust, had ridden clear from Zamosk to the south and east of Lublin, up to the charcoal burner's hut in the forest in search of fuel. The entire supply of charcoal on hand he contracted for immediately, at an astonishingly high price, with the provision that a large load of it was to be delivered at once by the burner to the castle in Zamosk. Even though it was in the dead of winter, the charcoal burner was quick to take advantage of this opportunity for a journey, with perhaps other orders, when he had reached the city. Besides, he had always wished to have his children see something of the world outside the forest, and now had come the chance. Powell he was forced to leave behind with the mother, but he took Michael and Elizabetta and the Nightingale. The father himself drove the span of oxen that drew the large sled, and Michael followed with another, in which rode the children upon more sacks of charcoal. Life on the road was in itself an enthralling and extraordinary adventure for the children. When once clear of the forest and along the highway toward the town, they joined in a great caravan of companies like their own, bound for the same destination, for the Christmas season was at hand, and money was plenty in Zamosk. There were sleighs laden with small trees for the holiday, traveling booths that would open for the sale of gifts and goodies, platform sleighs whereon players would enact scenes from the life of our Lord. There were cassocks with little horses upon which they could stand and dance, Tartars who could whirl for an hour without tiring or juggle swords for pennies, and even gypsies who had laces and cashmeres and read one's fortune on the palm of the hand. For 5 days the ox-drawn sleds creaked over the hard crusts. The days were a bit warmer than in the week preceding, but the nights were bitterly cold. It was the charcoal burner's duty, as each day ended, to find some humble tavern or hospitable farmhouse for his charges, where the oxen could be stabled and fed, and the children put to sleep upon the benches or floors. Wrapped in their bearskin coats and robes, they had suffered nothing from the cold. Even their feet had kept warm and comfortable in their high leather boots. Women greeted the children with joy and gave them the choicest places in their humble huts, while between the men passed always the customary greeting, Nich Benzi Pakwalia Jesus Christ, may Jesus Christ be praised, and the reply, Niweki Wayeku, to the ages and ages. And then they were given steaming beet soup, and when they had drunk it, there was placed before them stews of vegetables, bread, dried fish, and sometimes meat. Toward the close of the 5th day, the sleighs stood beneath the walls of the gloomy castle of Zamosk, gloomy because it rose into the sky unlighted, overlooking the town. It was Christmas Eve, and the star which betokens the coming of the Christ child was already hanging like a great lamp high in the heavens. The keeper of the draw lowered the bridge and admitted them, whispering, Jesus Christ is born, to which they replied with readiness, May his holy name be praised. You are expected, said the gatekeeper, but I warn you to make no noise while within the castle walls. The great lady orders it so each year, and all must obey. Wondering at this, they passed in silence. But there was gaiety in the castle yard, nevertheless. A company of boys carrying a star went by, singing in a low tone, wasradnosi sissy through night's dark shadow, and candles were gleaming from the rear of the company, where some were carrying a sazapka, or stable, a little box made of wood in which puppets would be made to enact the thrilling scenes of those days in Bethlehem when Christ was born. The oxen had scarcely come to a halt before the charcoal burner leaped to the ground and hurried for the kitchen in search of the seneschal, who would tell him where to stable his beasts and leave his supplies. The children, left to their own devices, began to exchange greetings with the crowd of Christmas revelers, the boys following the star, the servants of the mansion, soldiers and porters. Elsbetta prevailed upon the Nightingale to entertain the crowd with a song, and in a moment the sound of his sweet voice in the sharp, crisp air drew all about the sleigh, and the applause made the castle walls ring. Uh-oh. But at that, a man in watchman's armor and carrying a lantern and spear came hurrying toward the company. "What is the meaning of all this noise here?" he demanded angrily. "Has not the lady given commands these many years that silence should be kept in this court on this night? To your homes, all of you!" "Sir," the boy with the star stepped up before him, "I give you my word that we will make no such noise again, if you will but permit us to go about singing our carols and showing our puppets, for you know that tonight Christ is born, and every heart in Christendom is happy." The guard looked toward the upper windows doubtfully. "I know," he said, "but a command is a command, and it is because it was on Christmas Eve." However, he debated with himself for a moment. "I will allow you to proceed, but make no noise that can be heard above." Were this clamor to come to the lady's ears? But go on. He went back to his post, gazing with a melancholy air upon the heights above the yard. Truly they were melancholy too. A palace with less gaiety on this joyous night one might seek for in vain in all Poland. Its grim walls and buttresses seemed to be grimmer and drearier than ever in comparison with the lights and happiness below, and the huge turrets, soaring aloft into the starlight, were severe and somber and cheerless. High up in the castle, in a room hung with dark tapestries, an elderly man of severe countenance was standing by a couch upon which reclined a woman. She was not old, but the suggestion of some fearful experience distracted the attention somewhat from the actual beauty of her countenance. She was dressed in a long black velvet robe, caught at the waist with a golden buckle. From her throat hung down upon her breast a slender golden chain, at its end an ornament of silver, the emblem of the house of Sigismund Ray. The man was evidently an old servitor, a legal clerk perhaps. He had been reading from a parchment which he had held in his hands. "Thus, with the death of your second brother, the property reverts entirely to you," he said. "All others who might make claim to it are now," he was about to say dead, but changed to "with God's holy angels." "Little does it mean to me, Stephen. Indeed, my own days are numbered in this world." "Not so, my lady," he answered softly. "Do you not recall what the learned doctor of Krakow said? That you are only weary and sad, and that in due time will come back to you the spirit that we love. My lady," he bent over her, "I have served your family for many years. I drew up for your father the deeds which bequeath the property to your brothers and you, and afterward to the first male heir, be he yours or theirs. Now be to us who love Zamosk as a mistress who loves her people. There are fearful wrongs suffered at the hands of your brothers to be righted, sufferings to be recompensed, hearts to be gladdened. We have had but little peace hereabouts these many years." His appeal was but little effect. "Stephen, I tell you truly that my heart is sick of life. All that I have loved has perished. There remains to me nothing of flesh and blood that is my own. It is better that I should die. My brothers are dead. My husband died in the plague year in Poznan, and I am without kin or living issue." Her hand rose to her throat as if the heavy air of the room were stifling her. "Throw aside the tapestries at the casement, Stephen," she commanded, "and let in the air." He moved to the opening and drew back the cloth, and almost at the same instant a gentle burst of melody floated up from below. It came so sweetly sudden, and with such power and depth that the man stood for a moment motionless, gazing into the court below. The lady likewise, at the sound of it, raised her head. It was the sound of the nightingale, the song of deep woods and limpid lakes, now one bird calling to another, now the wind stirring in the tops of the pine trees, now the rain pattering on the soft needles underfoot. Then all at once the music died away, like the light raindrops that vanish at the sun. What was that? She demanded, staring. A peasant boy, standing on an ox cart, my lady. Stephen hesitated. You know, it is Christmas Eve. Now I know when it was on Christmas Eve so long ago they told me that my son. The boys have come with the star and Sazapka. She thought, sighed deeply, then raised herself on one arm. Bring them up here. Stephen went to her from the casement, an expression of wonder in his face. But my lady, you usually forbid them. Here, in this room? Yes, they may save me from my thoughts. He rushed to the door and called. A retainer answered, hearing his words, then darted down the steps to the courtyard below. A few minutes later he returned, ushering in the company, with Elzabeta, Michael, and the Nightingale following curiously. They just come wherever they want, come into the palace, into the castle, whatever. Other people are going. Come before me, she commanded. The children fell upon their knees. We have the Skopka. I think I pronounce it different every time. I don't think SZ is pronounceable by a mere American. We have, my lady. Two boys rose and brought the little puppet show forward. Stephen adjusted a chair and extinguished all the candles except those which illuminated the little stage, so that nothing was perceptible save the space where the Christ child in roughly carved wood lay sleeping, and the Madonna hovered above him. Behind the rude stall were seen the heads of cattle, and in front shepherds were kneeling. Begin, she commanded. I am Bartek the shepherd, recited one of the boys. It is Christmas Eve, and I am sleeping on the hills. And we are shepherds, shouted four others. The play proceeded. The angel comes from the sky to rouse the shepherds and make the pilgrimage to Bethlehem. They meet a soldier at the Bethlehem gate who warns them that Herod the king dislikes shepherds. Herod in his robe shouts at the top of his terrible voice when he hears that a new king is born, and orders the children of all Israel to be put to death. At this point, the first act ended. The chorus came forward to sing. While they were singing, the woman turned to Stephen, her eyes wet with tears. Stephen, she murmured wistfully, I believe that everyone in the world is happy this night except me. Would to God I had my own child in my arms and might sing him the lullaby that my mother sang to me. She gave way utterly, though quietly, to her tears. As her mind dwelt on her old grief, however, the tears dried, and there came the burning of pain that extinguishes the moisture in the springs from which tears flow. Sweetly, sweetly through it came the memory of her dead boy, as the child that he was when he slept in her arms, and she sang him the lullaby that every nurse in the house of Ray had sung since the days of Crocus the king. For a moment, the mere recollection of that melody soothed the fire of anguish, touching like cooling oil the throbbing courses of her thought. The accents rose at first from her heart, then intensified until the music seemed everywhere. Then suddenly it ceased in her thoughts, but miracle of miracles, it passed to her actual senses. Surely its joy was in the air. Her soul became passive. She drank in the loved measures as if they were food for the soul. Was it reality, or was it imagination? The music was in the air. It was too soft to echo in the distant corners of the room, or to reverberate against the walls, but it was there, rising from the dark space in front of her like a priest's benediction. Light the candle, she cried, rising from the couch. Who was singing that song? The leader of the Skopka, he who bore the star, fell upon his knees before her and answered, A peasant boy, my lad, he has been singing to us in the court, and we brought him with us. The candles were lighted, and the nightingale was hurried forward. He was about to kneel before her, wondering in his simple heart why the lady had taken such an interest in his song, when suddenly he was swept aside as by the veritable tempest, when the elder Stephen threw himself at the woman's feet. Now I must tell you, he spoke wildly, the secret that I expected to carry to the grave. and it were better for you that I had, since it can but add to the burden that you already bear. There is that in this scene that wrings it from me. Christmas Eve, the children, the Skopka, the lullaby of the House of Ray. My lady, your boy perished 6 years ago in the forest of Louisville. The forest of Louisville, she spoke perplexedly, for it seemed to her that the man's senses had suddenly taken flight. He died 6 years ago, it is true, when I was away in Poznan. It was when you were in Poznan, the man went on urgently, that your brothers, traitors beyond any of your dreams, decided that your son should not stand in their way. They imprisoned the child in a secret room of this very castle, circulated word of his illness, death, and burial, and then, not quite willing to kill him with their own hands, it seemed, they planned for him a no less awful fate. He was taken by night to a distant forest, a thick forest overrun with wolves, from which not even an unarmed man, much less a child, could come forth alive. The man who had held the horses on the night of this expedition came to me secretly months later, unable longer to contain the story. He said that 4 men had accompanied the boy, and that he had heard one of them mutter, "I see no joy in this excursion. It is a 4 days' ride behind swift horses to this part of the Louisville forest." Another had said, "Silence, you fool," and they had started. The 4 men never returned. And now, my lady, punish me as you will, I knew this, that to tell you at the time when it was too late was the same thing as to strike you dead. As the man had proceeded with his story, he had become quieter, and his words ringing truer and truer through his sincerity and grief, until the listener's face had paled. She was sobbing as he finished his tale, and the Nightingale, still standing near, wondering, unhappy at the sight of the great lady's sorrow, placed his hand timidly upon her sleeve. At the light touch, she seemed to leap from her world of sorrow to living reality, and the cadence of the lullaby burned again in her brain. "You, child," she exclaimed, "who are you? And where did you learn that song?" She took the boy's face in her hands and turned it toward the light, and as she saw his features clearly for the first time, "Stephen, Stephen," she screamed, "look at this boy. Whence came he, and why has he this hair and eyes and voice? Am I growing mad, or what?" But it was the boy who answered her somewhat bashfully, "I came with the charcoal burner from the forest of Louisville, and I am called the Nightingale." "From the forest of Louisville?" Stephen started and came toward the boy. "How old are you?" "I know not exactly. It is 6 years that I have lived in the forest." Stephen stared at the boy and at the woman. Neither of them noticed him, for they had sensed some feeling in common, and their eyes seemed to meet in some bond. "Your father and mother, are they living?" "That I know not. My foster father is the charcoal burner, and his wife my dear foster mother. But your real father and mother? That I do not know." Elzbieta pressed forward and took the boy's hand in her own. "He came to us out of the forest one evening long ago, before Christmas. Something had happened to him, for he could not speak, and indeed he did not speak for long afterward. But we call him the Nightingale, for he sings like one, and he knows the language of all the animals of the forest." The veins stood out on Stephen's head. He stepped to the boy's side and put his fingers beneath his chin, so that he must look up into his eyes. "Think, think," he commanded. "Was it 4 men on a wagon who took you into the forest on that winter night? Do you not remember wolves and the cold?" "I don't know, good sir. I cannot think." "And yet, wait, perhaps." He was silent for a moment, while at some suggestion from these words old memories poured again into his head. "It was not a wagon, sir," he said. He shouted suddenly, "It was a sleigh. The runners creaked in the snow." "God be praised!" cried Stephen. "Tell us what happened next." Then, out of the darkness of his mind, out of the cloud which had descended so long ago, a cloud of terror which mercifully the tender mind had not been able to endure, "I remember," he continued. "The forest was full of eyes." "Wolves," muttered Stephen. "And the men let me go. I ran into the forest and heard them screaming behind me." "Met their righteous fate, eaten by wolves," from Stephen. "I ran until I saw a light streaming from beneath a door. Our cottage," said Elzbieta, "and he came like the Christ child in the story. He is Stanislas, my boy." The lady's lips were unsealed. "He has come back to me from death," and she caught him up with her into her embrace. "Bring the charcoal burner hither," called Stephen, and he was brought in. He told his story briefly, confirming what the children had disclosed, then, gently disengaging the boy from the woman's arms, held up before them the charm which hung about the boy's neck. It matched the lady's charm, except for size, in every particular. And at that, the wildest shouts of joy ran through the castle. "The boy is alive! Our own has come back to us!" was shouted from man to man. They threw open the window hangings, set the place aglow with candles, and called in the musicians. They filled every corner of the castle with melody. An hour later, when all were tired of feasting, the lady sat upon her couch, no longer the sad and disillusioned spirit that had grown tired of life and forsworn happiness, but a transformed being aglow with life, eyes shining, cheeks radiant. The chorus gathered around her. The leader tuned them, and they sang, "Vivat Pan Yeso, vivat Maria, vivat Iosef Snech Campion." Yeah, you get the idea. And through it all, the Nightingale sat on the couch beside his mother, one hand clasped firmly in hers, and the other held proudly by little Elzbieta. The end.